First of all, I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to those who organized this, to Rabbi Buxbaum, to my Hamir group, also to OHEL, to David Mendel, our CEO, and to our Presidium, Mel Zachter and Jay Kestenbaum, making it possible for me to do these webinars and these trainings, and as well as the tech people who always are there, especially now as we are engaging in social distancing, enabling us to connect and have contact. This is a humbling experience for me because you guys are really the heroes, incredible heroes. All of you have taken some fairly significant risks for all of our well-being, and there's really not enough words and no ways in which we can express our gratitude towards you. And Hashem should continue to give you the resilience and the strength to help us until such time comes, God willing, soon, when we won't be needing any such rescue work. It's important to note, and let me just tell you how this is going to work. I have to get off no later than 8:55 because I'm running one of the 3 bereavement groups that I run during the week at 9 o'clock. So I need enough time to switch from one TheraZoom to the other. We'll end by then. I will speak now for, I'm going to guess, about a half hour, and then we'll have some time for comments, questions, etc. All of you are muted. That makes it possible for you to hear me. If you want to ask a question, or if you want to pose or just bring up a topic that you would like to hear covered, you'd have to unmute yourself, which I believe in the phones is *6. On the computers and the video phones, there's an icon where you can unmute yourself. But if you make a comment or ask a question, I'd ask you to please mute yourself again, because it makes it easier for everybody to hear. On the phones themselves, I think you have to push *6 to unmute yourself, and then you would push *6 again to remute yourself. If you want to ask a question or have any kind of input. So after about, as I said, I should be done in about a half hour with my part. That'll give us about 10-15 minutes just for informal conversation, discussion, points people want to bring up, or any questions about or issues that I may have failed to discuss. This, for those who cannot make it, if you know people who cannot make tonight's event, this is being recorded, and it'll be made available. The link will be made available. Most of these types of presentations are posted on the OHEL website and also posted on YouTube. So either place you can access, or people who may want to hear this who didn't have a chance can access this recording. Let me start by saying that we are all sort of self-selected for the kind of work we do. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created us all differently, and therefore we're all suited for the different tasks that we have. One Rav from my community puts it very aptly. He says that a finger has 5 fingers. A hand has 5 fingers. If they'd all be the same, it would be useless. The fact that the fingers are different makes us able to use our hands. And that's true for people as well. And those of you who are doing this heroic Hatzalah work, you are self-selected to do this kind of work. You have a tremendous amount of resilience, strength. You can tolerate a lot. You can go to scenes that most people would run away from, and not only run towards them, but do what is necessary despite however painful or grotesque the particular scene you are at. So you are by nature, if you will, very strong. You may be actually physically strong, but you're emotionally strong because you can do this. And what we're going to be focusing on today is going to be hard for you maybe to hear, because we're going to talk about your vulnerabilities, and we're going to talk about how in ways that you may not be aware of, or sometimes only aware a little too late, that this may be weakening you, that this may be getting to you. Because no matter how tough you are, or no matter how much you can handle, we're all basar v'dam, and it gets to us. And in fact, as I'm going to try to show you as we go through this webinar, it should get to you, because it's a measure of your humanity. If this kind of work and what's going on, and those of you who are on the front lines will feel it and experience it. And then, of course, I'm not going to be just hand wringing. I'm going to talk about what you can do to manage that stress. But what we're really focusing on has several names in psychology. I like to refer to it as secondary trauma. It's sometimes referred to as vicarious trauma. Vicarious is an English word, which means that you feel something somebody else is feeling, but you feel it as if you're feeling it yourself. So if you go to your friend Simcha and you see him happy, you can be vicariously happy. If you pay a Shiva visit and you see a friend, a loved one in pain, you're vicariously sad. So here we're talking about vicarious trauma, where you're sort of experiencing firsthand somebody else's trauma. So it's secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. Sometimes in psychology literature, this is referred to as compassion fatigue. And I don't particularly like that term. I don't think you get fatigued from being compassionate. I think being compassionate, being kind is energizing, not fatiguing. But it is referred to sometimes in the literature in case you were to come across an article, or as some of you may have done some social work training on that if you've come across it, it's sometimes referred to as compassion fatigue. But I'm going to refer to it as a secondary trauma. And there are several types of secondary trauma. In other words, secondary trauma is the trauma that you feel secondhand because you're somehow aware of or involved with someone else's trauma. So as I said, there are two types. There's a sort of distant one and there's a close one. So the distant one is you read about it in the paper or you hear about it from somebody else. So if you pick up the paper in the morning and you read about some traumatic event that happened to someone, particularly that happened close by, or perhaps when you picked up the paper, first heard about, let's say, the Jersey shootings, you were experiencing a trauma finding out about it. The other type of secondary trauma, which is, that's kind of universal. We all experience that. Second type of trauma which you are experiencing, secondary trauma that you're experiencing, is when you're actually involved in rescuing or helping the person who had been traumatized. So when you guys go to the scene of an accident, when you go to somebody's home where somebody is laboriously breathing because of the COVID-19, or if you see the terror and the shock of the family members, you're experiencing a trauma secondhand. That's secondary trauma. I and my team, when we are helping people process traumatic events that happen to them, then we're actually also we're also addressing secondary trauma. Now, and not surprisingly, secondary trauma is referenced in our Torah, most notably in the Shira. It says, Tipol alehem emasav v'fachad, and Rashi says right there on the spot, and I think it's citing, if I recall correctly, I think of the Mechilta, Rashi says, Tipol alehem emasa ala rechokim, pachad ala krovim. So pachad was the trauma of, I guess, the Egyptians drowning in the ocean. And the Amasa is the people who either witnessed it from the shore or read about it in the Moab times. So already Chazal knew of secondary trauma. Now I'm going to ask you a question. We'll engage in the age-old Talmudic tradition. Get your thumbs out. I'm going to ask you a question, and maybe a little bit later we'll try to answer it. If I were writing the Shira, and if Pachad is the primary trauma, the trauma actually in person, and Amasa is the secondary trauma, I would have written Tipol hem pachad ve'emasa. Why is emasa, why is the secondary trauma precede the primary trauma? And we'll answer that question shortly. I'll give you my answer. Not an answer I've actually seen in Mefarshim, but I'll give you my answer. But the interesting thing about secondary trauma is the reaction of the person who is secondarily traumatized resembles that of the primary trauma person. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the responses to trauma. There are many of them, most notably flashbacks. You know, you see scenes again and again, trigger responses. In other words, it could be the sound of sirens. It could be the smell of smoke. It could be hearing metal crashing. It could be anybody having a flu or a cold after those who have been traumatized by this most recent coronavirus. So that very same trauma response that the person, not very same, similar to the one who was primarily traumatized, the person feels secondarily, but there are differences also. First of all, one of the differences is it's milder. You don't feel it as intensely as the person who's been primarily traumatized. The other thing that's important, this is one of the most important points, that if you get nothing else for my presentation today. This is a very important point, which is that secondary trauma is cumulative. What do I mean it's cumulative? It's not the first time. It's not one event. It's not, let's say, the one pedestrian accident or the one child bleeding in the street. It's the 10th, the 23rd. It chips away, it grows on you. So in other words, each time you're going to the scene, or let's say with the COVID-19, each time you have to go to someone's home and you're dealing with someone who is, again, struggling to breathe, running a high fever, delirious or whatever, and you see the panic of the family, each time it sort of chips away. It takes away a little bit of your sense of security. So that secondary trauma is really cumulative. And that's what would make, and in that respect, secondary trauma is more dangerous than primary trauma. Because the person who's traumatized, let's say the family again, or the person who is beset with this terrible illness. The fact that he's traumatized, or that he may have been traumatized by spending 3 weeks in the hospital, 2 weeks on a respirator, with nobody there to visit him, with a medical staff that is spread thin and sometimes unavailable, that we can understand. And if a person like that is traumatized, we're very sympathetic. But when the Hatzalah driver or the crisis therapist is traumatized, it doesn't make sense. And very often when I'm dealing with this, and let's say if I'm dealing with a Hatzalah EMT, the person will say to me, "I don't get it, doc. This is my 15th vehicular accident. This is my 10th fall. I've seen it all. Why is this one getting to me? Why am I having flashbacks to this one? Why can't I sleep at night? Why am I now suddenly drinking too much?" I've been doing this for years, because what the person's unaware of, and that's why this is so important, is each time you go, it affects you. But each one alone doesn't affect you enough to get to you. But when they add up and add up and add up, it's a maka b'patish, or what was we say in English, is a straw that broke the camel's back. It's that last one, and then it gets to you, which, by the way, is one of my answers why the Torah says tipol emasa v'fachad and not pachad v'emasa, because in some respects, secondary trauma is more dangerous because you don't see it coming. It blindsides you. It hits you unexpected. And therefore, when it happens, you're totally thrown off. And I will tell you, I have gotten calls from some of the most heroic Hatzalah drivers, some of the emergency room doctors who have dealt with, that's their whole career, is managing the emergency room, from my own staff that have already for several years been doing death notifications and things like that. And then this one gets to them. And the reason why this one gets to them is because all the others have been getting them and they didn't see it coming. That's my one answer. By the way, my second answer is not particularly relevant to what we're talking about, but I think the other reason why it says the secondary trauma first and primary trauma second is, if you look in the context of the Shira, it's at that point in the Shira where, in the song itself, it's telling the people to learn the lessons, telling the nations. So what I think maybe what the Torah is telling us is to learn lessons from trauma. That's okay for the person who experienced it secondarily. So if you read in the paper of a trauma, you can say, what can I learn from this? Don't tell the person who was traumatized what he should learn from it. Just help him. So that's my other answer for the question. But in terms of what's relevant to us, yes, in some respects, the emasa, the secondary trauma, is more dangerous because you don't see it coming. And that's consistently what happens. And in fact, and as I'm going to mention later, one of the requirements, for example, on my trauma team, that if somebody goes on a very painful and difficult intervention, they have to come and process it. They have to contact me or my female counterpart and talk it over and talk it out. Because if you don't, it catches up with you and it throws you off. So that's what we're talking about. Now, there could be some other reasons also why these interventions get you. First of all, we're all a wreck right now. There's a real sakana out there. And so we're all afraid. And then we're all afraid of our loved ones getting sick. And it's not, it's permeated every community, every country. I think the only continent that hasn't been affected is Antarctica. But it's scary. And when we see it day in and day out, again, we can't help but to think, hey, what if this was my loved one? What if, so that's part of it. And sometimes even before there was this COVID-19. Some of the calls I've gotten over the years was, again, I'm going to focus on Hatzalah, but could be, by the way, another group that is traumatized, may not be represented here, and especially nowadays, Chaver Kadishas that have to do so many taharas. And the calls I'll get is, I remember once, a Chaver Kadisha person, where it says, I've been doing taharas for 10 years, 15 years, but this person looked like my daughter, and it got to me. And so sometimes it's just a reminder. And one of the points that we emphasize a lot in that training is what I often refer to as the mathematics of trauma. One of my colleagues often jokingly says that 5 out of 4 psychologists don't know math. But the mathematics of trauma is that if one traumatic event happens, and let's say we give it a value of 2, if another traumatic event concurs, happens at the same time, the 2 plus 2, it doesn't equal 4, it equals 8. And 2 plus 2 plus 2 equals 28, because it grows exponentially. And there's a trauma on top of trauma. My mother, Leah Shalom, who was a Holocaust survivor and had a treasure trove of Yiddish sayings, had one which I will not try to repeat out of respect for the language, but the saying when something like, when a poor man has a hernia, there's a pimple on it. And that's sort of what we're talking about, is that trauma on top of trauma grows exponentially. So if you're dealing with the general trauma of what we're all dealing with, and then you also have the added trauma of having to be the people in the front line who are taking people to the hospital and putting your own safety and health at risk, that grows exponentially. Now, obvious question can be, and I'm sure that's what you're wondering about, why? Why should something that happens to someone else affect me as if it was happening to me? That doesn't make sense. It's happening to this person. Certainly you can feel bad for that person. But why does it happen that we internalize it in such a way that in small increments, it becomes our own trauma? So, I'm going to try to explain that to you. And this maybe I'm about to try to make sense here. I'm going to give you a sort of silly example, but then that might make sense to you. Imagine you come to a chasna, all right? You don't know too many people. It's your third cousin or something like that. And you sit down at a table, and next to you, somebody else who also seems not to know, not to belong, or whatever, everything like that. And so you give them a shalom aleichem, and you start talking back in the days when we didn't have to be 6 feet apart. And you ask him, where are you from? So he says, I'm from Cleveland. So what is going through your head when this person said he's from Cleveland? Well, I'm sure pretty much all of you have answered your questions. Who do I know in Cleveland? What do I know about Cleveland? You're trying to reference, you're going through your own memory banks about what do you have to do with Cleveland. So you might say, I went to yeshiva with a guy from Cleveland. Do you know so-and-so? Or, I remember once I drove through Cleveland and, something like that. You're going to somehow reference anything and everything you know about Cleveland. Why? Why are you doing that? Who cares? And the reason is you want to connect to this person. You want to relate to him. We are by nature social beings. And so therefore, when we're around someone else, we have a sort of natural need to relate and connect to that person. So we try to look for overlapping experiences. Well, in a way, that's what happens when you go to someone's home and that person is traumatized by some fashion or another. You try to reference yourself what it must be like to be traumatized. You kind of check your data banks about traumatic events you may have had in your life, or you may search out some overlap that exists between, or your own capacity to be traumatized. So in a way, without even planning to do it, you are connecting and relating to the person, which is a beautiful thing and which is important because that's what we're supposed to do. You're going to be far more effective helping that person if you have some sense about what it must be like for him, what it must be like for his family. It's our capacity to what we call in psychology, empathize. Empathize, to really feel like somebody else. So the cause or the basis of secondary trauma is in the very human experience of wanting to connect to others. Ad kedei kach, that I would tell you that if you don't experience secondary trauma, there's something wrong with you. You're not a caring person because you should. You should experience secondary trauma because you should be trying to connect and relate to this other person. But if you're going to connect, and if you're connecting, relating to your friend who's marrying off his last child, his chasna, you're going to be very happy. It's a very nice thing to connect to. But if you can connect and relate to their pain, anguish, fear, dread, and you're seeking within yourself your own experiences of fear and dread, that's not a pleasant experience. So secondary trauma really comes from that very basic human tendency to connect and relate, and it's essential. So it's, in a way, you need to be traumatized. However, if you don't look at it and you don't address it, then it'll catch up with you and it'll have an impact on you. So let me now, I'll just see if I see some chats. I'm going to see if any of them are relevant to something I need to talk about. Okay, very good question. Thank you for bringing that up. Somebody mentioned that I should speak about guilt, and I will. I'm going to try to remember, but I will. It's a very important topic. I will talk about it. So let me talk about what you can do. And okay, let me talk actually a little bit about the guilt. That's a very good question. Let me read you the question from it's an anonymous question. By the way, you can send in questions privately, so nobody will know who. It won't be shown on it won't be for everybody. The Kiddush Levana one is for everybody, so so that's a reminder to say Kiddush Levana, okay. But if time allows you to touch on guilt feelings for advice, like I should have taken the patient early to the hospital, I should have taken him to that hospital, I should have intubated the patient, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so it's an excellent question. And there is a tendency when we're dealing with life and death situations to feel guilty. We ascribe to ourselves much more control and power than we really have. And when something so cataclysmic happens, like a death, we can't help but to think, was there something we could have done that we would have prevented that? And it's not logical. So I'm sure many people, many of you who feel this guilt, probably can say, "What are you nuts? They're taken to a different hospital. Every hospital was bursting at the seams. I think the only hospital would take him or intubate him. Are you going to hurry and intubate people when they don't have to be intubated? Then you're doing more harm than good. It's not a harmless procedure." So I'm sure up here, you know that you have nothing to feel guilty about. But when we're in situations like this, when we have such tremendous responsibility for the health and well-being, the survival of somebody else, it's such a big responsibility. And we tap into that belief that we're really in control and that we could somehow done it differently. So it's very common when you're making such big decisions to second guess yourself, especially if the outcome is not a positive outcome. And in fact, I will tell you that given what's going on now, we're focusing people a lot more on what they're doing, not outcome. Sometimes I find myself quoting a famous quote from Yisrael Salanta, Mensch darf tun, nicht darf tun. We have to focus on what we're doing because there are dreaded outcomes happening. For example, if Rahman al-Islam, a young child loses a parent, before there was this COVID-19 thing, and we or Hameir would come into the school to talk to the classmates, our focus would be, this is rare. It's terrible, it's scary, but you don't have to worry so much about your own parents dying because it's in today's world, it's something rare. We can't say that today. And unfortunately, because there's so many deaths, we really don't have that luxury. So instead, we're focusing much more on, look, we're doing everything we can humanly to prevent this from happening. And that's really what the focus needs to be in terms of response, towards guilt, is not judge based on outcome, but judge our actions, judge what we have done. There's another, by the way, type of guilt, since you brought it up, I'll mention it, which is a fascinating type of guilt. Which is what's called survivor guilt. It's been observed among Holocaust survivors. It was first observed among soldiers during World War I, which is that if you are in a situation, you're in a comparable situation with someone else, and you survive and somebody else doesn't, you feel guilty that you survived. The logic is that it was a gezerah that somebody should die, And it could have been you, it could have been this other person. And since this other person died, you're living on his expense. I don't know really if it works that way in Shemayim or not, but that's how the logic we impose on it. And sometimes when you're around so much pain and so much suffering, and you're okay and your family's okay, you can feel even guilty about that, which is a fascinating type of guilt. It comes with the territory. There's not probably much you can do. You can convince yourself that, look, I did everything I could. If you focus on your actions, if you review the situation, then of course it can relieve the guilt to some extent. It's just when you're dealing in situations of life and death. And again, it comes from a good place. It comes from how seriously you take your job and how invested you are in rescuing people. Again, if you could go through all this and have no guilt, there might be something wrong with you. But again, you have to realize that it's not based on reality. It's much more of an emotional response. Somebody asked the question about what about guilt if we were following instructions that we were told earlier and the instructions have changed. This is one of the very big problems we have today with this COVID-19 situation, is that there's so much we don't know. And the information is changing regularly. And it also makes it ripe for rumors or authoritatively reporting something that has not yet been verified. So a suggestive treatment or approach that looked promising but hadn't really been studied yet is suddenly being touted in the news, and everybody wants to do it. So this comes with the territory. And again, this is a very humbling experience. I don't know if that's why the Eibush is doing it, but we're being put in our place. And all the king's horse and all the king's men, all the big scientists and all the world leaders are lost. They don't know what to make of this, and the information changes all the time. So yes, there were probably a whole lot of instructions you got early on that now are not relevant. The rational side of you can say, look, nobody knew. The more emotional side is, again, it goes back to what I said earlier. You're doing life and death, and when you do life and death, you're always going to second guess yourself. So let's talk about what you can do to prevent this, what you can do, or at least to forestall this, either whether it's a guilt or it's a secondary trauma. Okay, first of all, what we call process it. Talk about it. And it's a fascinating thing, and people, it takes a lot of instruction to get this. But again, if let's say you would call me up and you would just, you had your 15th COVID-19 patient and it's getting to you, and you think you're having the symptoms and you're frantic and you want to check on your parents, you want to check on your loved ones, and although nothing's wrong with them, it's getting to you, you're getting traumatized. If you call me up and just talk to me about those 15 cases and what it was like, you're already going to feel better. If I say nothing, except maybe just to clarify, if I just listen to you, attentively listen, it suddenly seems more manageable. The very process of putting it into words makes it more manageable. So it is very important that you process these situations, that you sit down. It doesn't have to be the professional. Sit down in the garage and talk with each other. Talk to your spouse, call your friend, call your Rav, your mentor, whoever it may be. But talk it out, and if you talk it out, you already feel better. I often cite the famous study that was done after 9/11 by Basil van der Kolk. What he did was he took people who survived the 9/11 terrorist attack in the World Trade Center, and he hooked them up to a PET scan so he could watch their brain. And he told them, remember what happened. Just remember it. And the part of the brain that lit up was the amygdala, which is deep in the brainstem. It's the part of the brain that we share with the animal kingdom. It's all fear, emotion, impulses. And then he said to the person, now put it in words. Tell me what happened. And as he talked about it, you could literally anatomically see it shift from that very primitive part of the brain, deep in the brain, to the Broca center, the frontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that differentiates us from the animal kingdom. It's a part of the brain we use for language and logic, etc. With our brain we use when we learn. So it changes anatomically when you talk about it. And that's what I do, by the way, when I have to, after if there is a terrible tragedy and I need to go and talk to the guys in the garage and for the Hatzalah guys, we just talk. They just tell me what happened. And I listen, and maybe I clarify, but I don't give any great, brilliant answers. In fact, sometimes I think, what do they need me for? but it's the very process of putting it into words makes it more manageable. And by the way, particularly among yourselves, because you get it. You've all been there. So there's an understanding that you have that an outsider wouldn't have. And the fascinating thing for me when I've had to do these kind of interventions with Hatzalah, with Chevra Kadishas, once even with the fire department, once you start talking, all the other ones come back. It's like a waterfall. It's like an avalanche. You know, suddenly, hey, do you remember that? When you remember that car crash? Do you remember this one? How about that time when we had this and that? You start recalling because each one is sitting in your brain. It's sitting there and chipping away at your safety. So all of them come out. Even though I said Chaver Kadishas, I remember one of the most riveting experiences I had was after the Sassoon fire. If you remember, it's about 4 or 5 years ago, where 6 out of 7 children burned. We met with the Chaver Kadisha. And all the other taros that they ever did on children came back from 15 years ago, came back and needed to be processed and needed to be recalled. So it's a very important part of this work. And it should be something that you do routinely, which that will make a very big difference. And again, without aitzes, nobody's trying to give aitzes. Just speak it out, put it into words. The other thing is remind yourself of what you're doing. And it's not a time to be an unav. Remind yourself that you're part of something very big here. Remind yourselves that you are heroes, that you are saving lives. Not because you need to pat on the back, but it's so demoralizing, it's so scary. If you don't have that pick me up, if you don't have that feel good, it's going to become, again, the secondary trauma will be worse. And so I'm saying not to be boastful, not that you should go around, hey, I'm the greatest, but between yourselves or to yourself. Pat yourself on the back. Give yourself a compliment. You're doing incredibly heroic work, and you're taking risks, especially now. You're taking some serious risks for your own health and well-being to help others, and there's nothing more heroic than that. That's what a soldier does. So please, so as I said, it's not a time now to be humble. Also, by the way, another thing that I have seen when I've gone to Hatzalah garages after a trial, especially if it's, and usually when I have to go, it's one that didn't have a happy ending, is you remind yourselves of your competence. Now, very often what I've seen in the Hatzalah garage after, again, one of these terrible tragedies that they couldn't save the person, they do chazara. Okay, let's remind ourselves. What do you do? If you do this and this, we do this. And if it's this and this, we do this, and this and this. And the first time I saw that, I said, well, what are they doing? And I realized they're reclaiming their sense of competence. That you're really good, even if the outcome isn't positive, and even that you know what you're doing, and you guys do. You really, everybody knows that Hatzalah is the creme de la creme, is the best of the EMTs. Even the goyim know it, and yeah, but remind yourselves, even though there's such difficult circumstances, and even though you're not as successful as you'd like to be, that you're really good, and that you really know what you're doing. Okay, outlets, very, very important. And outlets can take, we know what's an outlet for Reuven is not an outlet for Shimon, which is even not an outlet for Levi. But what things that have calming effects? It can be physical exercise, and that doesn't mean you have to bench press 500 pounds. A walk, taking a walk or stretching or something like that. It could be music. Either playing music, again, it's fewer now, but playing music or listening to music. It can be art. It could be woodwork. It can be building. It can be learning. It can be learning. It can be davening. It can be tehillim. There are different things that we do that lower our blood pressure. And especially after you've come back from a difficult call, nowadays you don't just have difficult calls, now you have insane days. You may need to have in your schedule activities and healthy outlets, and that you have to be careful about also, because we all have our unhealthy outlets, our addictive behaviors, the drinking. It could be overeating. It could be temper outbursts. So you have to know your vulnerabilities. You have to insulate yourself and protect yourself from the unhealthy outlets and make healthy outlets part of your regular routine, part of your life. Okay, don't get callous. Don't get like uncaring. That's another thing, because sometimes it's just so much. Now, you do have to turn off the emotions. I think if every time you went on a call, you were fully cognizant, I know it's true for me also, but if you were fully cognizant of the enormity of the tragedy, you would be immobilized. You wouldn't be able to do what you have to do. But you can also go to the other extreme, because it's so much, you just kind of turn yourself off completely, and then you make it careless. Or then you might be not as attentive as you have to be. The art of doing emergency work, and I can relate to this myself as well, although I don't do the kind of work you do, but I'll do, let's say, a death notification, or I'll come right to a home right after a terrible tragedy. The art is to be aware of how important the work you're doing, how crucial it is, how life-altering it is, and at the same time, not so much so that you can't think straight. So you have to strike that balance. So you can go to either extreme. You can be either overly emotional and distressed, and then you're not thinking straight, or you can be like too removed and too distant, and then you might take chances, especially now when you have to take chances for yourself in terms of your own self-protection. It's important that you preserve some of your, some of the emotional awareness, especially day in, day out. I mean, if you've handled 30, 40 COVID-19 cases, by now they're not going to faze you much. And they should. They should either be both because of the suffering of the person who has it, but also because it is so highly contagious. You have to take precautions yourself, and also know your limits. That's very important. Know when when you've done too much. You're only human, and there are times. And by the way, I will tell you that there are times I will get calls from the top Hatzalah guys, the guys who can handle anything, who have handled suicides, shootings, and everything. And they're in saturation. They've gone too far. It's too much already, and they need to take time off. There's some I've told them, you need 6 months off. You need 6 months, and then you'll be better. But before it gets to that point, know how much you can handle. And it's very hard now when everybody's needed so much, and maybe now is not the time. But as soon as it is possible, acknowledge, tell the dispatcher, I'll do 3 days, but I can't do 7 days. Or I've had just 3 days of nonstop. I'm wiped out. I need a day off. I need 2 days off. And you'll be more effective sometimes on that 5th day if you have that interim time off. So no, and it's not a slight to you. That's one of the problems with secondary trauma among people like you, like I know, let's say even police officers, firefighters, because you're selected again because of your resilience and strength. And you can imagine a police officer going to his commander and saying, I'm so upset, I can't take it anymore. He's not going to get a promotion. So, you pride yourself in your strength, but part of being strong is knowing when you have to wave the white flag. I remember once I was in Eretz Yisrael, and I was invited to tour a drug rehab. And it just so happened to be that I came there, and the highest ranking Dati, religious officer in the Israeli army I think he was like a 2 or 3 star general. And he was much more interested in the drug rehab. But I remember 2 things he told me that were interesting, but one that's relevant here. He said, we think a good general in our army is someone who wins battles. But a good general in our army is someone who knows when to give up, when to wave the white flag, when to retreat. And that's part of being a good general too. In fact, they say General Washington was a great general because he knew how to get in retreat, how to back off. And that's part of it. And sometimes you have to know when to retreat. I see there's another chapter. Let me just sort of conclude with one final thought, and I'll see what the other questions are. The Medrash it's one of my favorite, if you can have such a thing, but it's by Eliezer going to find a wife for Yitzchak. Eliezer Sabah say, Chesed Adoni Avraham. Please do Chesed for my master Avraham. And the Medrash says, I think it's Bereshit Rabbah, if I recall correctly. The Medrash says everybody needs Chesed. Even Avraham Avinu, who brought Chesed into the world, who introduced Chesed to us, he needs Chesed. So therefore, we have to remember that even those of us who are doing Chesed have to sometimes need to Chesed ourselves. And sometimes we need to help ourselves. And sometimes we have to talk it out. And sometimes we have to take a break. And sometimes we have to just, or just cry or take a walk in someplace pretty just to, to reconstitute ourselves, because the givers of chesed sometimes need chesed as well. Okay, let me just see what I see. There's a bunch of chats, so let me just see what these questions are. Okay. Okay, so this is obviously, again, this is a thank you. So this is give to everybody from David Breuer, that thanking everybody who organized and orchestrated this. And yeah, I'm grateful that I can do it, and I certainly hope that's helpful. And I can also say, I should mention that on behalf of Ovel, and I'm sure I'm speaking for Meir and for Rabbi Buxbaum as well, that we're available. And if anybody needs assistance, where this is right now, the trauma team is 90% the COVID-19 crisis. I'm available personally, and Rabbi Buxbaum knows how to reach me. And certainly our team is available to whatever extent we can be of assistance. So please feel free to draw upon our assistance, as so many of us draw upon you for your assistance.